In today's episode, we'll explore the most terrifying zoo attacks ever caught on camera. From a zookeeper misjudging a tiger to a group of boys thoughtlessly taunting crocodiles. It was March 22nd, 2020. The morning air in San Antonio was cool, but there was already a hint of the warm day ahead. A light fog covered the glass walls of the lion enclosure at the Wild Kingdom Zoo, softening the sharp edges of the metal and rocks inside. The zoo was quiet, just starting to wake up. Zookeepers walked through their routines like a well-practiced team. A hose hissed somewhere, a gate clanged shut, birds called from above. Later, some would say the silence before the scream felt too perfect, like the zoo was holding its breath. Marissa Geinway was 21 years old. She had wanted to work with animals since she was 9 after visiting a zoo in Dallas. She had pressed her hands against the glass of the gorilla exhibit, amazed by the eye staring back at her. There was no big moment of realization, just a strong, steady interest that never faded. While other kids played sports or lost interest in school, Marissa read animal books, watched wildlife documentaries, and learned scientific names like they were songs. She was quiet, careful, and serious about doing things the right way. Her dad called her granular, meaning she paid attention to even the tiniest steps. In high school, she started helping a vet. Then she went to Colorado to study exotic animal care. People saw how responsible and focused she was. When a job opened at the Wild Kingdom Zoo, she applied immediately. By January 2020, she had become the youngest full-time zookeeper there. Her job wasn't glamorous. Most of her day was spent doing hard work, cleaning up poop, scrubbing water tanks, dragging heavy buckets of meat, and fixing fences. But she didn't mind. She respected the animals and believed they deserved good care. Her favorite animals were the lions, not just because they were powerful and majestic, but because of how smart they were. She liked watching how they moved, how they looked at each other, how they lived in a group. She treated them like living puzzles, always trying to understand them better. But working at a zoo isn't just about loving animals. It's about following rules, strict ones. The lion enclosure was one of the most dangerous places in the entire facility. It mimicked the African savanna, complete with rocks, trees, and shaded resting spots. A reinforced holding area kept the lions secured while staff entered the main enclosure. 2 heavy gates had to be locked before anyone could step inside. Checklists were followed, radios were tested, and no one ever went in alone, at least not before the pandemic. Lions are not forgiving animals. Adult males like Nero can weigh over 400 pounds and move with astonishing speed. In the wild, they are apex predators, using strength, patience, and teamwork to take down prey. In captivity, their instincts don't disappear, they wait, watch, react. Unlike some big cats, lions are socially and deeply territorial, alert to every sound, every shift in routine. Even after years in a zoo, a lion doesn't forget what it is. They don't need to be agitated to become dangerous, only given an opportunity. On that March morning, something went wrong. Marissa followed the usual steps, moved the lions into holding, closed the first gate, and pulled the second one shut. But her backup hadn't arrived, delayed by staffing issues and pandemic protocols. Normally, no one worked high-risk enclosures alone. But under the early wave of COVID-19, the buddy system had quietly eroded. It wasn't official, but everyone understood they had to make do. There was no panic in the footage later reviewed. Marissa looked calm, methodical. She walked the perimeter, checked the ground, prepared to clean and restock supplies. What she didn't know, what no one realized until later, was that the second gate hadn't latched. It looked closed, but it wasn't locked. Nero had been watching. He moved silently as lions do. When he slipped through the gate, there was no roar, no warning. By the time Marissa saw him, if she did, it was already over. The video doesn't show what Marissa was thinking when she stepped into the enclosure. It doesn't show whether she felt nervous or if she had a strange feeling in her gut. For approximately 2 minutes, it shows only a young woman crossing the rocky terrain in her khaki uniform, moving toward the far end where waste needed to be cleared and water needed replenishing. Then Nero slipped through the unlocked gate. He made no sound. Lions don't always roar, they hunt quietly. They're patient, strong, and fast. He moved low to the ground, his big paws silent. By the time Marissa noticed, if she even had, it was already too late. The attack happened quickly. Nero leapt at her, over 200 pounds of muscle crashing into her. His claws cut into her side, knocking her to the ground. The first strike likely killed her instantly, maybe to her neck or chest, but he kept going. Lions don't always kill quickly. They overpower their prey. Her radio made a short, broken sound, a few words and static, then silence. When the other zookeepers arrived running from the vet building, it was already too late. One worker screamed and tried to load the tranquilizer gun. The other froze, shocked at the sight. Marissa on the ground, her uniform torn and bloody, the lion crouched over her, still watching. It took nearly 5 minutes before they could get her body out. Afterwards, everything changed. The lion exhibit was shut down, some staff were sent home. Investigators reviewed footage, tested gates, and retraced Marissa's steps. Nothing malfunctioned. The gate had simply been left unlocked, a human mistake. News spread quickly. Her death shocked the public. Animal safety groups spoke out. Lawsuits loomed. Other zoos rechecked their protocols. Quietly, her family grieved. A memorial was held near the lion enclosure. Her parents stood by a tree she had loved where a photo showed her smiling beside a lion cub. Co-workers lit candles and remembered her careful nature, how she always double-checked, how much she cared. 5 months later, the enclosure reopened with new safeguards. Nero the lion remained. He hadn't changed. Lions don't feel guilt. They don't know what a mistake is. They only follow instinct. March 22, 2022 was a quiet morning in the hills outside Redding, California. A light fog drifted across the oak-dotted landscape, and the gravel roads leading to Brookfall Wildlife Preserve glistened faintly with dew. As the sun rose, it cast long, pale shadows across the compound's fences and enclosures, some housing wolves, others bears, and one set apart for a single large African lion. The day began like so many others at the preserve, peaceful, still, and unaware that something was about to go terribly wrong. The preserve, founded a decade earlier on former ranch land, served as both a sanctuary and educational center, focusing on animals retired from private ownership or closed roadside zoos. Its safety protocols were modeled on AZA guidelines but implemented without federal oversight. The carnivore yards were built for distance, high-gauge fencing, redundant locks, and strict no-contact policies. No keeper was to enter a predator enclosure alone, no exceptions. Erin Westeridge, 41, had been with the preserve since its earliest days. A seasoned animal care specialist, she was widely respected for her calm under pressure and her encyclopedic knowledge of big cat behavior. Colleagues described her as steady, organized, and deeply observant, someone who spoke little but noticed everything. She'd worked in wildlife rescue and captive rehabilitation for nearly 2 decades, spending time in Arizona, Colorado, and Oregon before settling in Northern California. She never married, had no children, and devoted most of her time to the animals. Brookfall wasn't just her job, it was her home. The lion she managed, Oba, had come to the preserve at 2 years old after being confiscated from an illegal breeding operation. Now 6 years old and over 400 pounds, he was a powerful, solitary male with deeply territorial instincts. Though not aggressive without cause, he had never been trained for close interaction. Erin respected that. Her routines were careful and consistent, protective contact only with no shortcuts. She had designed his feeding system herself and was the only keeper allowed to approach his yard unaccompanied during lockdown periods. That morning, she arrived early before the first shift change. She logged in, retrieved a bucket of enrichment materials, and walked toward the lion yard. Surveillance later recorded her entering the buffer zone just after 6 a.m. She carried no radio. The enclosure was quiet. Oba lay near the back fence, motionless. Aaron likely planned to refresh hay and scatter scent-based enrichment items before his scheduled feeding. It was something she had done hundreds of times before. But something was different that morning. Lions are ambush predators by nature. Unlike tigers who prefer isolation or leopards who vanish at the first sign of danger, male lions rely on surprise and brute force to maintain territory. Their instincts are blunt and immediate, especially when startled, provoked, or placed under unusual stress. Adult males can reach 500 pounds and deliver fatal injuries in seconds. As she stepped into the enclosure, Aaron paused briefly to scan the space. Oba still lay near the back fence, but his posture had shifted, head raised, eyes fixed. Something about the way he watched her was different. She moved slowly, adjusting the enrichment bucket in her grip, and glanced toward the feeding zone. Oba rose. His movements were unusually silent. Aaron hesitated, perhaps registering the change, but by then the lion was already closing the gap. There was no roar, no warning, just a low, sudden charge across the gravel. The impact was immediate. Oba lunged and collided with her torso, slamming her into the ground. The first bite landed across her shoulder. The second clamped down on the base of her skull. She cried out once, then went still. The staff response was swift but not without confusion. The junior keeper who spotted the blood had never seen a real attack and stumbled through the emergency protocol, fumbling the radio, struggling to recall Oba's tranq dosage. A more senior handler took over within minutes, rallying the DART team and securing the outer perimeter. No one volunteered to go in until Oba was fully down. When the tranquilizer finally took effect, it took 4 people to enter, retrieve Aaron, and exit again without risking another escalation. The scene left no ambiguity. Oba had responded as a predator, not a pet, and that realization changed the mood across the preserve in ways that lingered long after the body was gone. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A coroner later confirmed a fractured skull, cervical trauma, and deep puncture wounds. The cause of death was recorded as fatal mauling by a captive lion. Oba was not euthanized. He was relocated to a holding area within the preserve and placed under restricted management protocols. His behavior, though violent, was ruled consistent with predatory instinct, not pathology or abnormal aggression. Aaron's colleagues held a small service on the hill overlooking the sanctuary's enclosures. A brass plaque was placed on a stone at the edge of the lion yard. The preserve enacted immediate changes. No more early solo entry, no procedural exemptions, no matter the experience level. Even the most familiar animals were now treated with the same caution as any new intake. Among the staff, Aaron was remembered not just for her skill, but for the deep respect she showed every creature in her care, a respect that shaped the culture of the preserve long after she was gone. Aaron had always believed that routine builds trust, but she never mistook trust for safety. She followed every rule she helped write, and still, in the space between experience and instinct, one quiet morning turned into the last she would ever have. July 14, 2012 was a sunny Saturday in rural Sao Paulo state, Brazil. The midday heat hung heavy over the red clay roads and palm-lined fields outside Itataba, a quiet town known more for its sugarcane farms than for tourism. But nestled just beyond the city limits was a small, privately owned wildlife park called Recontro Animal, known to locals as a place to see exotic animals up close, often too close. Recontro Animal had opened in 1999 as a family-run attraction, originally featuring rescued farm animals and native wildlife. Over the years, it expanded rapidly, adding exotic species like big cats, primates, and reptiles, without the infrastructure or oversight of larger, accredited facilities. The park relied heavily on tourism and weekend visitors, promoting a more intimate experience than traditional zoos. While it had avoided major incidents in the past, its safety practices had been quietly criticized by animal welfare groups for years, citing minimal staff training, outdated enclosures, and poor emergency planning. That morning, Maya Santana, a 34-year-old school administrator from Campinas, arrived at the facility with her husband and 2 young children. The visit had been a long-promised outing, planned loosely over the previous month but finalized only the day before as a way to celebrate their daughter Clara's 7th birthday. With a busy school year behind them and Maya's schedule often full, the family hadn't had many chances for a day trip together. Maya had found the park online through a local parent group and was drawn to its promise of hands-on enclosures, close-up animal viewing, and a relaxed, family-friendly environment. Something simple and memorable for her children to enjoy. Maya was known for being careful and practical, a loving mother and a respected figure in her community. At her elementary school, she was the kind of person teachers turned to for advice and parents trusted without exception. She didn't take risks and was often described as level-headed and responsible. Her decision to visit Recanto Animal had been thoroughly researched, or so she thought. The facility was small, less than 10 acres, but packed with big attractions: monkeys, pumas, leopards, and even a full-grown Bengal tiger. But the highlight was its pair of African lions, housed in a large open enclosure with a raised wooden viewing deck above. The design gave guests a clear overhead view of the lions below, separated by a roughly 10-foot drop and a reinforced fence that extended around the perimeter of the habitat. At 1:45 p.m., after lunch in the shaded picnic area, Maya and her family joined a group of other visitors along the elevated platform above the lion habitat. The wooden railing at the edge of the deck was built to standard height, but there were no additional safety barriers or netting to prevent accidents. Several children pressed up against the railing to get a better look at the lions. The African lion is one of the most iconic predators on Earth. Social, territorial, and built for strength. Adult males can weigh over 500 pounds and possess a bite force of roughly 650 pounds per square inch, capable of breaking bone with ease. A lion's primary hunting tools are its sheer muscle, retractable claws, and powerful jaws, which it uses to suffocate or disable prey. Though lions in captivity lack the need to hunt, their instincts remain intact, and any perceived intrusion into their territory can trigger immediate violent response. Unlike big cats that prefer stealth, lions are known for their explosive attacks, fast, overpowering, and designed to end a struggle quickly. Clara climbed onto the lower beam of the railing, attempting to see over and down into the enclosure where Nero, a 6-year-old male lion, was lying in partial shade. Maya stepped forward and reached for her daughter's waist to pull her down. In doing so, her foot slipped on the worn wooden planks and she lost her balance. With nothing to hold on to, Maya tipped forward and fell over the railing, landing hard inside the enclosure below. The fall was approximately 18 feet. Maya struck the ground on her left side, fracturing her pelvis and stunning her on impact. For several seconds, she remained motionless. Nero rose to his feet almost immediately, his attention drawn to the sudden movement and sound. As Maya tried to sit up, Nero approached, closing the distance in seconds. He struck her across the back with a full-force swipe of his paw, knocking her face first into the dirt. The impact tore through skin and muscle, leaving deep lacerations across her shoulder and ribs. As she tried to crawl away, he bit down on the back of her neck, dragging her deeper into the enclosure. The lion began to treat her exactly as he would prey in the wild. He used his powerful forelimbs to pin her to the ground, repositioning his grip to bite into her shoulder and upper back. Then, with violent force, he raked downward with his hind legs, tearing through fabric and flesh in a defensive feeding behavior known as bunny kicking. Nero's jaws clamped around the base of her neck again, compressing her spine. As blood soaked into the dry dirt, he bit into her upper thigh, tearing tissue from the muscle in an attempt to reach the femoral artery. Maya had lost consciousness within moments of the mauling, but Nero continued the attack as if she were still struggling. Above, the viewing platform was in chaos. Guests screamed and pulled their children back from the railing. Staff arrived with poles, fire extinguishers, and tranquilizer rifles. At 1:52 p.m., the first dart struck Nero's hindquarters, but the lion did not retreat. He dragged Maya several feet before a second dart hit, slowing his movements. It took nearly 5 minutes for the sedatives to fully take effect, causing Nero to collapse near the rock ledge. Emergency responders arrived at 2:04 p.m., entering the enclosure once it was declared safe. Paramedics assessed Maya at the scene and found no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at 2:11 p.m. The autopsy confirmed the extent of the trauma: a severed vertebral artery, multiple fractured ribs, a shattered pelvis, and deep lacerations across her torso and limbs. The cause of death was listed as exsanguination due to cervical trauma, consistent with both the fall and the lion's attack. News of the incident spread rapidly across Brazil, prompting a nationwide outcry over lax safety at Recanto Animal. Within days, state investigators launched a formal inquiry, uncovering a series of violations that raised serious concerns about the park's operations. These included unreinforced railings along elevated platforms, a lack of secondary containment around high-risk enclosures, insufficient signage, and an absence of trained emergency personnel on site. Surveillance footage and eyewitness reports confirm that the fall had occurred due to preventable structural shortcomings, and officials concluded that the facility had failed to provide adequate safeguards for visitors. While the incident was officially classified as an accident, the zoo was found to be negligent in maintaining basic safety standards. Recanto Animal was temporarily shut down, fined by local authorities, and ordered to complete a full overhaul of its safety protocols before reopening to the public. Nero, the lion involved in the attack, was placed under observation and was later transferred to a wildlife sanctuary in Rio Grande do Sul, where he would live out the rest of his life with no further contact with the public. Zoo officials stated that the lion had acted on instinct and would not be euthanized. Maya's death sent shockwaves through the community. Her school held a memorial service attended by hundreds of students, families, and colleagues. She was remembered not for the tragic way she died, but for her compassion, leadership, and unwavering commitment to children. Her story later became a case study cited in several safety reform initiatives targeting private zoological facilities across Brazil. June 14, 2009 was a cloudy Saturday in Yekaterinburg, Russia. At the city zoo, a crowd of weekend visitors wandered the paved footpaths, pausing at enclosures and leaning over barriers. Families pointed out the animals, children begged for snacks, and strollers rolled quietly past faded signs. The gorilla exhibit, a sunken pit surrounded by iron railings and stone retaining walls, was one of the zoo's oldest features. A single western lowland gorilla lived inside. Kuba, a 19-year-old silverback imported from West Africa nearly a decade earlier. That day, he sat alone beneath a concrete ledge, chewing slowly on leaves, only occasionally glancing up at the people watching from above. It felt like just another lazy afternoon, but one mistake would soon turn it into something else entirely. Near the rail, 12-year-old Katya Sokolova climbed up for a better look. She was there with her mother and younger brother. It wasn't a special trip, just a casual family outing on a gray summer weekend. Katya wore a pale green hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Her mother held her under her arms to steady her on the narrow ledge, while her brother leaned against the bars nearby. Like every other weekend, families leaned in for a closer look, never thinking how little separated them from the wild. The Yekaterinburg Zoo, established in 1930, had long been a staple of the city's cultural life, but its infrastructure had not kept pace with modern safety standards. The gorilla enclosure was outdated, surrounded by a chest-high iron railing with no secondary fence or protective glass. Below was a hard concrete floor and a scattering of plastic enrichment items. Warning signs in Russian cautioned against climbing or leaning, but they were small and often ignored. Incidents had been rare, but staff had raised concerns about the aging barriers and the risks of falls, concerns that had gone unaddressed. Western lowland gorillas like Kuba are known for their intelligence and usually docile nature, but they are still immensely powerful animals. Adult males can weigh up to 350 pounds and have a bite force stronger than that of a lion. In captivity, they often develop patterns of boredom and stress, especially when kept in isolation or limited environments. And when startled, provoked, or panicked, their reactions can be sudden and devastating. Katya shifted her weight slightly as she tried to peer over the ledge. Her sneaker lost traction. Her mother grabbed for her, but it was too late. Katya slipped from her grip and tumbled over the rail, dropping more than 10 feet into the pit below. The sound of the impact was loud enough to draw gasps from the people nearby. She landed head first on the concrete and rolled to her side motionless. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the screaming began, her mother shouting, others yelling for help. A bystander ran to alert zoo staff, another pulled out a phone to call emergency services. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered, some trying to wave their arms and distract the gorilla, others frozen in place. Kuba stood up and looked toward the fallen girl. At first, he only watched, but the shrieking and the frantic motion from the railing above stirred him into action. As more people leaned over, shouting and waving their arms, he let out a short bark and began to pace. Then he turned and charged. In one explosive motion, he lunged at Katya's motionless body. The first strike landed with bone-cracking force against her side, flipping her onto her back. He stood over her and slammed both fists down onto her chest, then seized her by the arm and dragged her several feet across the enclosure. Witnesses screamed as her limbs flailed limply. Kuba lifted her partially from the ground and bit down, once hard into her shoulder. Blood spread across the concrete. He beat his chest, grunted violently, and bit her again, this time at the base of the neck. The attack continued for over a minute, with the gorilla alternating between swatting, stomping, and mauling her limp frame. Zoo staff were already in motion, but it took time to assemble the sedation equipment. A loud horn blared from the opposite end of the enclosure, briefly distracting Kuba, but he returned to Katya's body and struck her again before finally backing off. Eventually, a dart struck the gorilla in the upper thigh. He stumbled slightly and retreated to the far end of the enclosure. Once he began to show signs of sedation, staff entered the enclosure and retrieved Katya's body. She was still alive when paramedics reached her, but unresponsive. CPR was initiated during transport, but she was pronounced dead less than an hour later at the hospital. The autopsy confirmed a fractured skull, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. Doctors later stated that while the fall alone had caused serious trauma, the attack from the gorilla was the fatal factor. In the aftermath, the Yekaterinburg Zoo was temporarily closed to conduct internal assessments. Investigators documented the safety violations that had allowed the fall to occur: insufficient railing height, lack of protective barriers, and outdated emergency access procedures. The gorilla enclosure was permanently closed. Kuba was relocated to a different facility under more controlled conditions. The exhibit was dismantled. New safety regulations were quietly rolled out across regional zoos in the following months, including stricter barrier standards and revised viewing platform designs. Emergency response drills were updated and parents were instructed more clearly at entrances about safe conduct near animal enclosures. Katya's parents did not speak publicly in the weeks that followed. According to hospital staff, her mother remained in the waiting room after the news was delivered, refusing to leave until well after dark. The family held a private funeral the following week, attended by close relatives and classmates. No statements were released, no interviews given. What happened at the zoo became a dividing line in their lives, before and after. It was December 2nd, 2017, in the village of Abovtrud, located in the Istra district 25 miles west of Moscow. The air was cold, the ground damp from the early morning fog that clung to the barren trees. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, but no one in the village paid it much mind. Life moved slowly in Abovtrud. The people here were used to the quiet, used to the isolation that came with living at the edge of civilization, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a place where secrets were easily kept, and conversations often took place behind closed doors. Sergei Alexandrovsky, a man with a fortune made in the airline industry, lived in the heart of this village. At the time of the incident, Sergei was the CEO of Rosia Airlines, a company he had built from the ground up. But beyond his business dealings, Sergei had another passion: animals. In the early 2000s, he had built a private zoo at his home, a menagerie of exotic creatures that was open to select visitors. It wasn't a grand zoo by any means, but more of a collection of animals housed in small enclosures, their cages barely large enough for the creatures inside. A lion, a tiger, and a black panther were among the most notable residents. The zoo had become something of a local curiosity, although most villagers had grown accustomed to the sounds of the animals: the distant roar of the lion, the unsettling grunting of the tiger pacing back and forth. While it wasn't officially marketed, the zoo was open to those who knew Sergei personally or could gain access through word of mouth. It wasn't until 2020, when the government passed a law banning the private ownership of exotic animals, that the zoo came under any real scrutiny. But by then, the animals, including the panther named Milan, were protected under the law's grandfather clause, and no one paid it much attention. On December 2nd, a group of 3 men from Ukraine found themselves in Abovtrud, visiting a nearby acquaintance. They had been drinking heavily, reliving old memories and telling stories of their youth. The alcohol had flowed freely, leaving them with a sense of invincibility. Their visit to the zoo had not been planned, but the alcohol prompted them to venture to Sergei's zoo. They had heard about the zoo during their stay, and with their judgment clouded by the alcohol, they thought it would be a fun idea to visit. It was late afternoon when they arrived at the cage of Milan, the black panther. The animal lay lazily on a wooden perch, its glossy black coat almost blending into the shadows. Milan didn't seem interested in them, its eyes unblinking as they stared back. The men, drunk and emboldened by alcohol, began to joke about feeding the panther. One of them, in a mix of alcohol-fueled confidence and foolishness, claimed he could do it. The others laughed, egging him on. A dare was a dare, after all. They hadn't considered the consequences, nor did they care. The panther remained still, watching them with an almost indifferent gaze. The man, spurred by the challenge, walked closer to the cage, but the narrow bars kept him from reaching the animal. The lock on the gate was secure, but that didn't deter him. The alcohol had dulled his judgment, and he felt an inexplicable surge of bravado. He had been watching the panther. Its placid demeanor lulled him into a false sense of safety. He didn't think it would react. His fingers fumbled with the lock. A few seconds passed, and with a soft clink, the lock broke. The gate creaked open. At that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Milan's indifference turned into focus. The panther's body tensed, its gaze now sharp and predatory. The man, in his drunken arrogance, stepped closer. Before he could react, the panther lunged. The leap was swift, a blur of black fur and powerful muscle. The man's body crashed to the stone floor, Milan's weight pressing down on him. The air filled with the sound of the man's scream, but it was cut short as the panther sank its teeth into his throat. Blood spurted from the wound, a pool quickly forming beneath them. The man's body went still, his final breaths shallow and ragged. The other 2 men stood frozen, staring in horror. Their first instinct was to flee. Whether they were hoping to find help or simply running for their lives, it didn't matter. They left their friend behind, abandoning him to the cold stone floor, his body slowly growing still. The panther, having satisfied its initial bloodlust, stood up, stepping over the man's body. It sniffed the air, its instincts guiding it. The gate had been left ajar. The panther moved carefully, stepping out into the open air. It hesitated for a moment, uncertain of its surroundings, but then, with a graceful movement, it slipped past the gate and into the wild, its steps silent but deliberate. Hours passed before anyone discovered the incident. The authorities were alerted, and Sergei Alexandrovsky arrived at the scene. He had been informed by a local, perhaps the one who found the body or heard the screams. Sergei's arrival was swift, but his reaction was oddly detached. He claimed the man had been drunk, someone who had wandered into the enclosure on a dare. Sergei denied knowing the man, although it was assumed by many that the man's identity was known to him. The details of the attack remained unclear, but the focus soon shifted to the panther that had escaped. The authorities, meanwhile, kept the situation quiet. They made no public warning and took a more private approach to handling the panther's escape. They did not inform the villagers of the danger lurking nearby, perhaps fearing panic or unwanted attention. As the hours passed, some villagers began to worry about the possibility of the panther being nearby. Children had been playing outside, unaware of the danger. People had been walking their dogs, oblivious to the fact that a predator had slipped past the gate. It wasn't until much later that the panther was found, hidden beneath a thicket of brush, its eyes wary and alert, its muscles tensed as it adapted to the unfamiliar terrain. The authorities managed to recapture it, but it had been hours since the attack. During that time, it could have been anywhere. Sergei, ever the protector of his animals, insisted that the panther should not be put down. The local reaction, however, was one of anger. The zoo, still open for business, became a symbol of fear and frustration in the community. Many felt that Sergei's failure to secure the animals properly had put their lives in danger. There were whispers of how, had Sergei himself been the victim instead of the Ukrainian man, perhaps the zoo would be shut down and the neighborhood would be free from fear. An investigative committee was assigned to the case, but no conclusions were ever made public. The name of the deceased man was never disclosed, and the report remained sealed. The authorities made no effort to uncover the full truth. What was known for certain, however, was that Milan had acted in self-defense. The panther had protected its territory, responding to the intrusion of an unfamiliar human. It was early on a Saturday morning, October 11, 2008, when the city of Melbourne woke up slowly under the soft light of spring. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and gentle winds moved through the tall eucalyptus trees. Near the edge of the city, not far from the tram lines and breakfast cafes, the Melbourne Zoo began another day. Zookeepers moved through the gates, unlocking enclosures and preparing food. Birds called from the trees. Lions stretched in their warm dens. And deep inside the zoo, the gorillas rose with the sun. But someone else was awake too. His name was Liam Carter. He was 25 years old and had been standing outside the zoo since before dawn. He didn't shout, he didn't try to get attention. He just walked slowly back and forth along the fence, staring through the bars like he was looking for something. Most passersby and zoo staff didn't notice him. A few glanced his way and kept walking. He looked like any other quiet young man, but Liam was not okay. He had lived most of his life with a serious mental health condition called schizoaffective disorder. This meant he sometimes saw or heard things that weren't real, and his thoughts could become confused. He had been in the hospital twice before when things got bad. Medicine helped him stay stable, and he had regular check-ins with doctors. But lately, Liam had stopped taking his medication. He didn't tell anyone. He was afraid. He thought he could manage on his own. He couldn't. Liam lived alone in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood called Carlton North. His neighbors saw him now and then, usually wearing the same faded green jacket, walking the same path each day, muttering to himself. He liked routines. He avoided crowds. The zoo had always been one of the few places he felt calm. He especially loved the gorillas. He often stood for hours by their enclosure, watching them move through the grass and trees. He felt a connection to them, especially the silverback gorilla Kabari. Kabari was huge and powerful, but also quiet and thoughtful. To Liam, the gorilla wasn't just an animal. He seemed like something more, something that understood what it meant to be alone. But this morning, Liam wasn't just visiting. Something in his mind told him that the gorillas were calling to him, that they needed his help. He believed he had to go in. The zoo was big, over 50 acres of winding paths, tall trees, and quiet back roads. Behind the scenes were areas the public never saw: delivery gates, keeper walkways, and small sheds for tools and food. That's where Liam got in. A delivery truck had just come through one of the side gates. The security arm lifted, the guard waved the driver in, and for a few minutes no one was watching. The gate didn't close fast enough. Liam saw the gap and stepped through unnoticed. Once inside, he followed narrow paths marked staff only. These walkways were shaded by trees and blocked from public view. Most cameras didn't cover them closely. Some were set to record only, not watched live. Others had blind spots. Branches, shadows, or corners missed during camera checks. Later, security teams found Liam on the footage, but it was already too late. That day, the zoo wasn't understaffed, but it was distracted. A baby giraffe had been born that morning, and many keepers and volunteers had gone to help with the medical checks. Visitors crowded near the giraffe house, and attention shifted. For a short time, the usual routines were off track. No one expected anything strange. Liam moved like someone who belonged. He didn't run or hide. He walked slowly like a worker on a quiet job. Nobody stopped him. He passed food carts, fences, and sheds until he heard the sound of running water near the gorilla exhibit. That's where the tragedy began. The gorilla enclosure was one of the zoo's most carefully designed areas. It looked like a forest in Africa, with rocks, plants, and even a small waterfall. The gorillas lived behind a short barrier and a wide moat, which kept people out without needing tall fences. Most visitors knew not to go in, but Liam didn't see danger. He saw something he believed was calling to him. Kabari noticed him immediately. The silverback stood flanked by two females and a young one calmly eating leaves. The moment Liam stepped through the water, Kabari froze. His eyes locked onto the figure entering his space. This wasn't a zookeeper, no tools, no familiar smell, just a tall man moving strangely. At first, Kabari didn't charge. He rose to his full height, towering, broad, and let out a deep grunt. Slow, steady thuds echoed as he pounded his chest. The females backed away. The young gorilla ducked behind a log. Kabari stepped forward, blowing a sharp huff of air through his nose, eyes locked on the man in his territory. Gorillas, especially silverbacks, are not naturally aggressive. They're guardians, not killers, using posture, sound, and sheer presence to avoid violence. In the wild, a dominant male defends his group by standing between them and danger, making it clear he'll fight if forced. But when those warnings are ignored, when that threat keeps coming, instinct takes over. In a closed space with no room to flee, a silverback does what it must. Liam kept walking, arms raised, maybe in peace, maybe in confusion. But to Kabari, this wasn't surrender, it was a threat. He charged, chest pounding, legs thundering. The massive gorilla slammed into Liam before he could react, knocking him flat. Kabari pounded his fist onto Liam's back and chest. Liam tried to curl up, but the hits were too strong. The gorilla grabbed him and dragged him several feet through the dirt. Blood stained the ground, bones broke. The sound was sickening. Zookeepers heard the screams and rushed toward the enclosure. One keeper immediately saw what was happening and called for emergency help. Another grabbed the tranquilizer gun. Kabari stood over Liam's body, breathing heavily. He didn't run, he didn't keep hitting, he just watched. The tranquilizer dart hit Kabari in the side. Within a few minutes, his muscles relaxed and he dropped to the ground. Staff raced into the habitat and pulled Liam out. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Liam had died before anyone could reach him. The official report said he died from blunt force trauma and internal bleeding. His eyes were still open when they found him. News of the incident spread quickly. Some blamed the zoo, others the mental health system. Gorilla experts said Kabari acted like any silverback would, protecting his group from a perceived threat. Tragic, but expected. The gorilla habitat closed for weeks. Staff noticed Kabari had changed. Slower, more withdrawn. Whether from confusion, stress, or sedation, no one knew for sure. Liam's funeral was small. A few relatives and someone from his clinic attended. No memorial, no statue. But his story didn't disappear. In response, Victoria launched programs to train public workers to spot signs of mental illness early. The zoo improved signage and security, but the deeper lesson was about unseen struggles, like Liam's. Today, the enclosure is open again. Children watch Kabari wander the trees, older now, quieter. The flowers have returned, the grass is green. But somewhere between the shadows and stones, a memory lingers. Not in plaques, not in speeches, but in the silence, where a confused mind stepped into a wild world and ancient instinct answered. April 9, 2013 was a warm and humid evening in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, its golden light cast long shadows over the Belo Horizonte Zoo, one of the largest zoological parks in the country. The day had been uneventful, with families and school groups visiting the exhibits before making their way to the exits. By 6 p.m., closing announcements echoed over the intercom, urging guests to leave. Among the visitors that day was Gabriel Ferreira, a 32-year-old community volunteer and former athlete. He had arrived at the zoo alone, purchasing his ticket at 3:20 p.m. Security footage later showed him moving from one enclosure to another, pausing occasionally to observe the animals. Unlike most guests, he didn't take photos or linger at the popular exhibits. As the zoo emptied and the gates locked at 7 p.m., Gabriel was nowhere to be seen. Gabriel Ferreira was well known and well liked in his neighborhood of Pampulha, a district near the zoo. A former semi-professional football player, he had once been a promising athlete, playing as a midfielder for a local club. However, a knee injury at age 26 had ended his career prematurely. The transition had been difficult, but rather than drift aimlessly, Gabriel had poured himself into his community. For the past 5 years, he had worked at a youth center coaching underprivileged kids in football. He helped organize tournaments, secure funding for equipment, and mentor young athletes who, like him, had dreams of making it to the professional leagues. His passion wasn't just the sport, it was the kids who looked up to him. Outside of coaching, he was an active member of local charity projects. He helped with food drives, volunteered at a homeless shelter, and even assisted in an animal rescue group. By all accounts, he was a man who gave more than he took, which made what happened that night all the more shocking. Among the many animals Gabriel had passed that afternoon, none were more dangerous than the one he would later encounter. The jaguar, Panthera onca, is South America's apex predator and one of the most powerful big cats in the world. Unlike lions and tigers, which suffocate their prey, jaguars use bone-crushing bites, their canines puncturing directly through skulls. Their bite force of over 1,500 psi makes them capable of breaking through turtle shells, thick bones, and even reinforced cages. Jaguars are also silent hunters, known for stalking prey before attacking with sudden explosive force. In the wild, they hunt capybaras, caimans, and even cattle. In captivity, their instincts remain intact, making them one of the most unpredictable predators in zoos. At Belo Horizonte Zoo, the most famous jaguar was Django, a 6-year-old male weighing over 240 pounds. His enclosure was built to mimic the dense forest of his natural habitat, featuring thick foliage, rocky terrain, and a water feature. What led Gabriel to scale its walls remains a mystery. At 8:10 p.m., an hour after the zoo had closed, Gabriel emerged from a concealed spot near the big cat enclosures. His clothing was covered in dirt, suggesting he had been lying low for some time. Security footage later revealed that he had hidden inside a restroom near the reptile house, avoiding detection as the last visitors left. Making his way to the jaguar habitat, he stood near the outer fence for several minutes, seemingly assessing the enclosure. No one knows what he was thinking. The jaguar enclosure was surrounded by 2 barriers, a 10-foot chain link fence with barbed wire and a 15-foot concrete wall behind it. Scaling them was no easy feat. At 8:27 p.m., he began climbing. Using the metal framework of the fence, he pulled himself up, maneuvering carefully to avoid the barbed wire. The climb took nearly 4 minutes, after which he dropped down between the 2 barriers. At 8:35 p.m., he scaled the concrete wall, using footholds in the rough surface to hoist himself up. He reached the top at 8:39 p.m. and sat there motionless, his figure barely visible against the dimly lit habitat. Then, at 8:42 p.m., he lowered himself into the enclosure. The soft dirt shifted as Gabriel landed inside the habitat. He took a step forward, his posture relaxed. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the far side of the enclosure, Django moved. Jaguars are masters of stealth, and Django had been watching from the darkness. As Gabriel stepped closer, the jaguar reacted. In 3 seconds, Django closed the distance, launching himself from the shadows with terrifying speed. Gabriel barely had time to turn before the jaguar slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. As he hit the ground, Django's claws clamped onto his skull. Jaguars don't waste time with suffocation. Their instinct is to kill instantly. Django bit down harder, and a sickening crack echoed through the enclosure. Gabriel's body went limp, but the attack wasn't over. Still locked onto his skull, Django dragged him deeper into the enclosure, disappearing into the dense foliage. At 9:20 p.m. during a routine patrol, security guard Luis Antunes noticed movement in the jaguar enclosure. At first, he assumed Django was just active for the night. Then he saw the blood. Luis's flashlight beam landed on a horrifying scene. A mangled body partially hidden in the undergrowth. Django stood over it, his muzzle dripping with fresh blood. At the sight of the scene, Luis immediately reached for his radio and reported the emergency. Within minutes, additional zoo staff arrived at the jaguar enclosure, carrying tranquilizer rifles and equipment to separate the animal from the body. Django remained near Gabriel's remains, his posture low, muscles tense. When keepers attempted to distract him with food, he didn't respond. One of the staff fired a tranquilizer dart, striking him in the hindquarters. The jaguar reacted with a brief snarl, ears pinned back, but did not immediately move. Within minutes, the sedative took effect, and Django sluggishly retreated into the dense foliage at the back of the enclosure. Once the animal was no longer an immediate threat, zoo staff unlocked a service gate at the rear of the enclosure, allowing emergency personnel inside. 2 paramedics along with a police officer entered first, carrying medical equipment. Their flashlights illuminated the ground, revealing disturbed earth, torn clothing, and blood stains in the sand. Gabriel's body lay motionless, partially concealed by undergrowth. His injuries were severe, his skull visibly fractured and his limbs unnaturally positioned. There was no movement. At 9:35 p.m., paramedics conducted a brief examination before covering the body with a white sheet. 2 additional responders entered with a stretcher, and together they carefully lifted Gabriel's remains and carried him through the enclosure's rear gate to a waiting ambulance. Its red and blue lights flashed against the concrete walls of the enclosure as law enforcement arrived to secure the scene. Gabriel's autopsy confirmed that his skull had been crushed with severe trauma to the brain. His body bore deep bite wounds and claw lacerations, but the fatal injury had been the first bite. His death shocked the community. The kids he coached at the youth center were devastated, struggling to understand why their mentor, who had always taught them about discipline and safety, had done something so reckless. His family refused to believe it was intentional. His brother insisted Gabriel was not the kind of person to take such risks, but no one could explain why he had gone into that enclosure. Meanwhile, Belo Horizonte Zoo faced scrutiny, but officials maintained that security protocols had been followed, as the barriers met safety standards and there was no containment failure. Django remained at the zoo as he had acted on instinct and posed no ongoing threat. After a mandatory observation period during which zookeepers monitored his behavior, he was returned to his normal routine. While some questioned whether he should remain on display, the incident was ultimately deemed the result of human trespassing rather than a lapse in zoo security. As time passed, public attention shifted and life at the zoo resumed as usual. Gabriel's death, however, left more questions than answers. His family and colleagues struggled to understand why he had taken such a risk. Was it an accident, a dare, a moment of recklessness? No one would ever know. But one fact remained: a single decision had cost him everything. October 27, 2019 was a gray, quiet morning in central Illinois. Just outside Springfield, Meadowview Wildlife Park sat behind a line of cottonwoods and chain-link fencing, a modest facility with faded signage, gravel paths, and a small collection of regional and exotic animals. It wasn't a major attraction, but it had a loyal local following. Families came on weekends, school groups visited in fall. That morning, behind the closed gates of the carnivore wing, a routine task was about to turn deadly. Daniel Harker, 32, was one of Meadowview's senior keepers. A Springfield native, he had joined the zoo after studying wildlife ecology at Southern Illinois University and had worked his way up over nearly a decade. Daniel was known among staff as meticulous, soft-spoken, and deeply committed to animal care. He didn't crave the spotlight, but often volunteered for the most difficult routines, working with predators, handling transport prep, monitoring new hires. He kept a notebook in his locker where he logged feeding behaviors and enclosure quirks, and on slow days he could often be found quietly repairing enrichment items or upgrading safety signage around the grounds. For Daniel, Meadowview wasn't just a job, it was a calling. As a boy, he had spent hours wandering its paths, studying each species plaque and watching the animals with a kind of reverence. Over the years, that awe never left him. He took pride in the small, invisible details: the right mulch for primate enclosures, the placement of logs and boulders for natural behavioral stimulation, the silence that meant a predator was at ease. If something needed fixing, he fixed it, not for praise, but because the animals deserved nothing less. He arrived just after sunrise, parking in his usual spot near the maintenance shed and clocking in before the other staff. The morning's assignment was familiar: clean the tiger enclosures, reset enrichment, and prep for the mid-morning feed. The park's 2 Bengal hybrids had already been shifted into their holding stalls for isolation, and Daniel proceeded toward the habitat corridor with hose and rake in hand. It was a routine he'd done dozens of times in a space he knew better than his own apartment. But that morning, something was just slightly off. The air felt heavier, the silence stretched longer, and Daniel, ever diligent, didn't ignore it. He just kept moving forward. The tiger habitat at Meadowview was one of its oldest and most confined. A rectangular yard enclosed by reinforced mesh fencing and concrete walls, it measured just over 1,200 square feet, large enough for pacing and shallow digging but too narrow for natural terrain. There were 2 adjoining holding pens with vertical guillotine doors that allowed the cats to be shifted in and out during cleaning. Visibility from guest areas was blocked during off hours, but staff corridors ran directly behind the exhibit fencing. with only a single access gate to the yard itself. On most days it was secure, but on this morning one of the guillotine doors hadn't fully latched. Jiva, the 450-pound male, had access to the main yard. Tigers are apex predators, and even those raised in captivity retain every tool they need to stalk, strike, and kill. Adult males can leap more than 20 feet and deliver a single paw swipe with enough force to fracture bone. Jiva had been at Meadowview for 4 years, transferred from a defunct roadside attraction in Ohio. Though typically calm around keepers, he remained isolated from guests and had never been directly approached on foot outside of medical sedation. Daniel stepped through the service gate and into the habitat without hesitation. The morning air was quiet, filtered through the mesh panels above, and the gravel beneath his boots crunched softly with each step. He scanned the enclosure, eyes moving automatically toward the shaded end where Jiva typically lounged. It looked empty, still, almost peaceful. He called the tiger's name once out of habit, but got no response. A few enrichment items lay scattered around the logs. Everything seemed routine. What Daniel didn't see was that Jiva was already watching. The tiger had been resting in the shadow of a rock overhang out of direct sight from the service entrance. Years in captivity hadn't dulled his instincts. If anything, they'd focused them. His world was smaller, quieter, more reactive. The smell, the sound, the motion of something unfamiliar, like a human entering at the wrong time, triggered a switch. Daniel made it less than 10 steps before Jiva moved. The tiger launched forward without warning, a 400-pound blur of orange and black. The first blow struck him square in the back, slamming him to the ground. The second came almost instantly, a crushing bite to his shoulder and neck that jerked his upper body sideways, twisting it violently. Jiva didn't stop. The tiger dragged Daniel several feet across the gravel, biting down again near the base of his skull. His claws raked along Daniel's back, shredding his uniform and leaving deep lacerations in their wake. He shook his head with short, brutal motions, then pinned the body beneath his chest with a low growl and opened his jaws again. Daniel never had a chance to radio for help. In the adjoining corridor, a co-worker heard the scuffle and moved quickly toward the access gate. Finding the outer door still locked, they immediately turned back to call for assistance. Inside the habitat, the attack continued for nearly a full minute. By the time help arrived, it was already too late. Staff used fire extinguishers and noise devices from the fence line in an attempt to drive the tiger back. It took several rounds, but eventually Jiva retreated into the holding pen. Once secured, the yard gate was opened and Daniel's body was pulled from the enclosure. He was still breathing, but unresponsive. CPR was initiated on site and paramedics transported him to the nearest hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The cause of death was listed as excessive blood loss due to trauma. The injuries included a severed carotid artery, fractured vertebrae, and multiple deep puncture wounds across the upper body. The zoo was closed immediately. Officials from OSHA and the USDA arrived the following day to inspect the site. The malfunctioning latch was removed and analyzed, found to be misaligned and partially rusted from prior rainfall. The facility's enclosure designs and emergency access systems were reviewed, and new mandatory double verification procedures were added to all predator handling protocols. Jiva was not euthanized. He was relocated weeks later to a larger sanctuary with no on-foot keeper interaction. The decision drew quiet support within the zoological community. Jiva had behaved like a tiger, and the system in place had failed to protect the human in his path. Daniel's memorial was held privately at a local church. The zoo later placed a small plaque near the staff break room bearing his name and the date of the incident. At Meadowview, procedures were rewritten, locks were replaced, but for those who worked alongside him, the loss was not procedural. It was personal. Daniel hadn't been reckless. He hadn't ignored training. He simply trusted a system that didn't hold up. June 15, 2023 at the San Diego Zoo was like any other summer evening. The sprawling 100-acre facility had closed its gates at 8 p.m., leaving only essential staff to monitor the grounds. The lion enclosure, situated in the heart of the African Savannah exhibit, housed 6 magnificent African lions behind its 16-foot concrete walls and inward curving fencing. The pride's dominant male, Zulu, had been the zoo's star attraction since its arrival 5 years prior. African lions are apex predators known for their immense strength, speed, and lethal precision. In the wild, they hunt in coordinated packs, taking down prey much larger than themselves. Despite their majestic appearance, they're responsible for hundreds of human fatalities annually in certain regions of Africa. Even in captivity, their primal instincts remain intact, making any interaction with them inherently dangerous. The barriers at zoos are not merely for observation, they're a necessary divide between life and death. Marcus and his friends, however, failed to grasp this reality. As the zoo settled into silence, Zulu and his pride dozed atop their elevated rocks, their ears twitching at the occasional rustling from nocturnal animals nearby. But that night, unfamiliar voices and stumbling footsteps would stir something deeper, the primal instincts of an apex predator. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical troublemaker, he was a dreamer, a young man with an insatiable curiosity for the ocean and its mysteries. A junior at San Diego State University studying marine biology, he maintained a 3.8 GPA and worked part-time at the local aquarium, where he loved teaching children about marine ecosystems. His mother, a single parent, had sacrificed everything to put him through college, and Marcus carried the weight of her dreams alongside his own. Beyond academics, Marcus had a passion for adventure. He was the type to surf at sunrise, hike treacherous trails, and dive into freezing waters just for the thrill. His friends admired his fearless nature, but they also knew it sometimes led him into trouble. Professors described him as bright and promising, though sometimes prone to peer pressure, a fatal flaw that would cost him his life. On the night of June 15th, Marcus and his friends gathered outside, savoring the warm summer air with drinks in hand. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just another carefree night like many before. The group consisted of Marcus, Jake, Tyler, Chris, and David, close friends, all around the same age. Though Marcus was the youngest at 23, he never let that stop him from keeping up. At first, the night was lighthearted, just laughter, casual conversation, and the comforting familiarity of longtime friends. But as the alcohol flowed, so did their boldness. What started as harmless fun soon escalated into reckless dares, each challenge pushing them further past the limits of common sense. The group egged each other on, daring one another to attempt feats they'd never consider sober, sprinting across empty intersections, scaling rooftops, and balancing on ledges, each stunt riskier than the last. The thrill of danger coursed through them, drowning out any hesitation. The line between excitement and recklessness blurred, and none of them realized just how close they were to crossing it. Marcus, always eager to prove himself, embraced the chaos. To him, pushing limits wasn't just exciting, it was what made life worth living. Fueled by adrenaline and the need to impress, he took every challenge head-on, feeding off the group's wild energy. Security cameras captured them approaching the zoo's perimeter fence late that night, their phone lights bobbing erratically in the darkness. Marcus, his judgment clouded by countless shots of tequila, had thrown out the idea of sneaking into the lion enclosure to take wild photos. It was a ridiculous, idiotic suggestion, the kind that should have been dismissed outright. But in their drunken state, the absurdity of it only made it more appealing. It wasn't about logic anymore, it was about proving who had the guts to do something truly outrageous. It started as a reckless thought, but the mix of alcohol and peer encouragement quickly turned it into a dangerous reality. His friends would later recall trying to talk him out of it, but their own intoxication prevented them from being more forceful. A maintenance gate, improperly secured during an evening shift change, provided their entry point. While security responded to a routine motion sensor alert near the elephant enclosure, the intoxicated students made their way through the darkened pathways, their loud whispers echoing through the empty grounds. When they reached the lion exhibit, the pride lay sprawled across their elevated rocks, basking in the dim zoo lighting. Nearby, a maintenance golf cart had been carelessly left behind, an oversight, a clear violation of zoo protocol. But to Marcus, it was an opportunity. Despite some of his friends' protest, likely the ones still sober enough to recognize the insanity of it, he climbed onto the cart, using it to hoist himself up onto the enclosure wall. Jake, one of his friends, tried to stop him, calling the idea reckless and beyond stupid, but Marcus only laughed, waving him off. Chris, on the other hand, egged him on, shoving him playfully and calling him a coward if he didn't go through with it. Fueled by alcohol and the intoxicating thrill of the moment, Marcus felt unstoppable. The danger didn't register, only the adrenaline rush, the chance to do something outrageous, something that would make people talk for years. He wasn't thinking about consequences, he was thinking about glory. After a few minutes, Marcus lost his balance. The alcohol dulled his reflexes, clouding his judgment and making his footing unstable. As he teetered on the narrow ledge of the enclosure's outer barrier, his arms flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto. The world seemed to tilt, and before he could steady himself, his foot slipped. He stumbled forward, crashing over the edge and plummeting into the enclosure below. The impact drove the air from his lungs, his pained gasps echoing in the night air. He had landed in the worst possible place, face first into fresh lion dung, the acrid smell filling his nose, adding humiliation to what would soon become a fatal mistake. Above him, his friends stood frozen in shock. But Marcus wasn't alone for long. The lions had noticed. Zulu's reaction wasn't immediate. The lion rose slowly, his ears pricked forward, golden eyes unblinking. Then Marcus stumbled, cursing loudly and waving his arms in frustration. The attack was explosive and devastating. Zulu's massive paw crashed into Marcus's back, claws raking through fabric and skin. Before Marcus could process what was happening, the lion's powerful jaws clamped around his shoulder, crushing muscle and bone with terrifying ease. With lethal precision, Zulu adjusted his grip to Marcus's throat, severing arteries in an instant. Jake and Tyler fled in horror, while Chris stood frozen at the viewing area. David managed to call 911, his trembling voice barely coherent as he reported the emergency. Zoo security arrived within minutes, armed with tranquilizer guns and high-powered rifles, but it was already too late. The rescue attempt was both desperate and futile. Security personnel fired multiple tranquilizer darts at Zulu, but the adrenaline-fueled lion remained focused on its prey. By the time the tranquilizers took effect, Marcus had been dead for several minutes. It took a team of 8 people to retrieve his body from the enclosure. The aftermath sent shockwaves through the community. News of the tragedy spread quickly, dominating local and national headlines. Public outrage erupted, with heated debates over whether the zoo had failed in its duty to secure the facility or if Marcus and his friends bore sole responsibility. Social media buzzed with conflicting opinions. Some called it a senseless tragedy, while others labeled it as an example of reckless thrill-seeking gone horribly wrong. The San Diego Zoo held a press conference where officials expressed deep regret over the incident while defending their safety protocols. However, scrutiny mounted as investigations uncovered security lapses. Animal rights organizations also weighed in, some arguing that captivity itself was to blame for such encounters, while others focused on the dangers of human interference. The psychological impact on Marcus's friends proved devastating. None of them could erase the image of Marcus's final moments, the primal brutality of the attack, and the sickening realization that there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fraternity faced a year-long suspension, though an investigation found no evidence that they had orchestrated the zoo break-in. It was the night of July 14, 2012. High temperatures in Yerevan, Armenia hovered as dusk gave way to an oppressive summer night. The city was mostly quiet. The kind of night where the streets emptied early and even the insects seemed to buzz in slow motion. Behind the dim glow of a broken street lamp in a small public park just blocks from the city zoo, 3 men loitered near a battered bench, their conversation loud and slurred. The group had been drinking heavily for hours, local vodka, cheap beer, whatever they could get their hands on. Bottles clinked against the bench legs and cigarette smoke curled lazily into the warm air. Among them was Edward Karsumian, aged 34, an unemployed laborer with a history of petty arrests and a reputation for reckless behavior. Friends knew him as charismatic but unstable. He had a past peppered with impulsive choices, dropping out of school at 16, quitting jobs without notice, starting fights in bars. Born and raised in Yerevan's working-class Nornork district, Edward had struggled to find direction since his teenage years. His parents divorced when he was young, and his father, a retired machinist, had largely distanced himself from Edward's troubled adulthood. With no steady job or family obligations, Edward spent his days drifting between short-term gigs and late nights on the streets. Those who knew him said he craved risk. His closest friend described him as someone who wasn't afraid of anything, especially not consequences. He'd once scaled a crane at a construction site for no reason other than to prove he could. Another time, he narrowly escaped arrest after setting off fireworks in a closed public square. It wasn't that he sought out trouble, it was more that he never flinched when it found him. That night, as the alcohol blurred the line between reality and bravado, Edward's eyes kept drifting toward the dark silhouette of the city zoo's perimeter wall in the distance. At just over 8 feet high, the barrier didn't appear overly secure. One of the men joked about sneaking in to see the animals. The joke turned into a dare, and the dare, under the influence of liquor and ego, soon became a plan. The zoo, like many underfunded public institutions in post-Soviet Armenia, operated on a shoestring budget. Maintenance was prioritized over upgrades, and staffing levels were barely sufficient for daytime operations, let alone comprehensive overnight security. The perimeter wall, built decades earlier, hadn't been reinforced in years, and its lack of motion sensors or surveillance cameras made it more of a symbolic boundary than a real deterrent. At night, with only one guard assigned to monitor the entire property, and often stationed at the front gate, vast portions of the zoo were effectively unpatrolled. It was a reckless impulse, but not an unusual one for Edward. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the 3 men were seen on surveillance footage approaching the wall from the south side. They scaled it using a large tree near the fence line and dropped onto the internal pathways of the zoo. By this point, their coordination was visibly impaired. The security footage captured them stumbling, laughing, and pointing at enclosure signs, none of which they seemed able to read. The zoo, lit only by sparse maintenance lights, was eerie in its stillness. Occasional grunts or growls echoed faintly, but for the most part the animals were asleep. Investigators later determined that the group wandered aimlessly for nearly 15 minutes before reaching the large cat exhibits. They passed several fenced areas before stopping at a low black iron railing near the tiger enclosure. The habitat, designed to simulate a wild terrain, was set into a depression in the earth. It featured natural rock ledges, a dry moat, patches of high grass, and several large boulders. The men leaned over the edge, whispering and laughing, until one of them urinated into the enclosure. Another tossed in a bottle cap. Then Edward climbed over the railing. Statements from his friends and video analysis indicate that he didn't hesitate. Usually, such enclosures would have at least a secondary barrier behind the railing, but budget constraints and construction delays meant it had never been built. He dropped roughly 6 feet into the enclosure, landing hard on a patch of packed soil. He laughed as he stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. His friends laughed with him for a moment, but a sobering realization immediately loomed over them. They shouted for him to climb back up, but the damage was done. From the shadows of the enclosure, two adult Siberian tigers began to stir. They were both male, massive creatures bred in captivity, but wild in every way that mattered. Siberian tigers, the largest of their kind, are solitary and territorial by nature. In the forest of the Russian Far East, they rely on stealth, power, and precision to hunt and survive. Even in zoos, far removed from the brutal efficiency of the wild, those instincts remain intact. With retractable claws that can slice through flesh and jaws strong enough to crush bone, they are apex predators, lethal, reactive, and intolerant of intrusion. A tiger doesn't see a person who has crossed the barrier as a guest, it sees a threat. When Edward dropped into their world, he didn't just enter a restricted space, he shattered a boundary written into the animal's core understanding of survival. And the response was immediate. What happened next unfolded in under 30 seconds. One of the tigers moved first, slinking low through the grass. Edward turned in time to see it charge. The impact knocked him off his feet. Massive claws tore into his chest, slicing through his shirt and digging into muscle. As he screamed and tried to crawl backward, the second tiger lunged. Its jaws clamped down on his neck. The two animals dragged him across the ground, their combined weight pinning him as they began to tear into his torso. The two men above froze in terror. One vomited, the other ran. Neither made any attempt to help. Even if they had, it's unlikely they could have saved him. Edward was dead within moments. His body was partially dismembered and large sections of his chest and face were mauled beyond recognition. The tigers remained near the body, pacing and agitated, as the men fled the scene. It wasn't until 6:45 a.m. when the zoo's morning crew arrived that the attack was discovered. A groundskeeper making rounds noticed blood on the rocks near the tiger enclosure. He immediately contacted zoo officials who in turn called police. By 7:30 a.m. the area was cordoned off and veterinary staff tranquilized both animals to allow emergency responders to recover the remains. Edward's body was removed in pieces. A formal identification was made using fingerprints. Toxicology reports later confirmed a blood alcohol level of 0.21%, more than twice the legal limit for driving in Armenia. His friends turned themselves in later that day. Both gave statements describing the events, though parts of their accounts were inconsistent due to memory gaps. They weren't charged with any crime but were held for questioning and released after 48 hours. News of the incident spread quickly. Some outlets condemned the zoo's poor security, while others blamed the men's reckless behavior. The zoo, though facing public scrutiny, remained open. In a brief, solemn statement, officials admitted to security lapses but emphasized that the tigers had reacted instinctively to an intrusion. They urged the public to respect the fragile boundary between humans and wildlife, a boundary that only works when it's not crossed. The tigers were not euthanized, a decision met with both praise and criticism. Experts agreed the animals had simply defended their territory. Edward Karsamian was buried 3 days later with only a few in attendance. His mother, silent and pale, placed a childhood photo on his coffin, Edward beneath a tree, smiling. In the following months, the zoo reinforced parts of its fencing and added new warning signs, but the wall near the tiger enclosure was never climbed again. March 15, 2019, in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, morning mist clung to the acacia trees around Vindhvadhar National Park as sunlight pierced the canopy. This 445-hectare sanctuary served as both a national park and zoo, housing rescued wildlife in semi-natural habitats after the previous night's thunderstorm. Inspector Rohan Bhattacharya had served the Madhya Pradesh police for 19 years, earning respect for his methodical approach and unwavering dedication to duty. At 43, the father of two had volunteered for the Wildlife Protection Unit 3 years prior. understanding that human-animal conflicts required experienced officers who could remain calm under pressure. Known for his by-the-book approach, yet reluctant to wait for backup when civilians might be in danger, Rohan had built a reputation for handling situations personally rather than risk delays. Having grown up in rural Madhya Pradesh, where encounters with wild animals were common, he believed his childhood experience gave him an intuitive understanding of animal behavior, a confidence that had served him well in previous incidents, but made him less cautious about approaching dangerous animals alone. The emergency call reached the station at 7:12 a.m. Night security reported structural damage to the outer perimeter of Enclosure Section C, where the facility housed its rescued sloth bear. The storm's intensity had loosened several fence panels, creating gaps large enough for the animal to escape. Park officials requested immediate police assistance while they assembled the specialized containment team. Rohan arrived within 15 minutes, accompanied by Constable Vikram Singh, a junior officer with limited experience in wildlife situations. The zoo's morning feeding staff had not yet begun their rounds, leaving the back corridors eerily quiet except for the distant bird calls and the occasional rustle of leaves. Sloth bears, despite their deceptively sluggish name, rank among India's most formidable predators. Adult males can weigh up to 140 kilograms and possess powerful limbs equipped with curved claws measuring up to 8 centimeters in length. These omnivores develop their impressive physical capabilities to tear apart termite mounds and defend against tigers and leopards in their natural habitat. Their unpredictable temperament makes them particularly dangerous when startled or cornered. Unlike other bear species, sloth bears attack with remarkable speed and persistence, using their claws to inflict devastating wounds before delivering crushing bites with their powerful jaws. Rohan and Constable Singh approached the damaged enclosure area through the service corridor behind the feeding yards. Metal crates and maintenance equipment created shadows in the dim morning light. The inspector carried a standard-issue flashlight while Singh remained near the corridor entrance, monitoring radio communications with the approaching containment team. A metallic scraping sound emerged from behind a stack of shipping containers approximately 10 meters ahead. Rohan signaled for Singh to maintain his position while he investigated the source. The inspector assumed the noise indicated either escaped livestock or possibly the bear attempting to return to familiar territory. Moving cautiously toward the containers, Rohan turned on his flashlight and swept the beam across the concrete floor. The light revealed scattered hay and overturned feed buckets, but no immediate signs of the missing animal. As he stepped around the largest container, the sloth bear exploded from its concealment behind a maintenance bin. The animal's initial swipe caught Rohan across the left side of his face and neck, the claws tearing through skin and muscle tissue with surgical precision. The impact sent him stumbling backwards as his flashlight flew from his grasp, clattering against the concrete wall. Before he could regain his balance, the bear's second strike raked across his chest, shredding his uniform shirt and opening deep lacerations from his right shoulder to his sternum. The bear then lunged forward, its massive jaws clamping down on Rohan's left forearm as he instinctively raised it in defense. The crushing force fractured both the radius and ulna bones, while the animal's canine teeth punctured through to the bone. Rohan collapsed under the bear's weight as it began shaking its head violently, causing additional tissue damage and arterial bleeding. Singh's shouts for assistance echoed through the corridor as he activated the emergency alarm system. The piercing siren seemed to agitate the bear further, prompting it to release Rohan's arm and deliver a devastating bite to his torso. The animal's jaws covered the area between his lower ribs and abdomen, causing massive internal trauma and severing major blood vessels. The bear dragged Rohan's motionless form behind the shipping containers, away from the corridor entrance. His severe blood loss and internal injuries proved fatal within minutes of the initial attack. The specialized tranquilizer team arrived 23 minutes after Singh's emergency call, successfully sedating the animal and recovering the inspector's body. The Madhya Pradesh Forest Department launched an immediate investigation into the security protocols surrounding the damaged enclosure. Preliminary findings indicated that routine storm damage assessments had been delayed, allowing the bear to remain undetected in the service area for several hours. The sloth bear was relocated to a more secure facility in Kanha National Park, where enhanced containment measures prevented similar incidents. Zoo management implemented additional safety protocols, requiring two-person teams for all wildlife-related emergency responses. March 12, 2015 began as another frigid late winter day in Minsk, Belarus. The morning fog hung heavy over the Soviet-era zoo complex, its concrete walls still holding the previous night's chill. Families and school groups moved between exhibits, their breath visible in the cold air, while the distant sounds of various animals echoed across the grounds. None of the visitors could have predicted that in less than 12 hours, their local zoo would become the scene of one of Eastern Europe's most horrific incidents. Alexei Kuznetsov, 23, worked as a delivery driver for a local grocery chain. Standing 5'11" with an athletic build from years of amateur soccer, he lived with two roommates in a modest apartment near the city center. Known for his easy smile and quick jokes, Alexei was popular among his co-workers and had a reputation for being the life of any party. His mother, a schoolteacher, had raised him alone after his father left when he was young. Despite struggling financially, she had ensured he completed his education and found stable employment. Alexei wasn't ambitious. He was content with his simple life, regular paycheck, and close circle of friends. His supervisor described him as reliable if somewhat immature, noting his tendency to joke around during shifts. That Thursday evening, after finishing his shift at 7 p.m., Alexei met his closest friends Ivan Popov and Dmitry Sokolov at the Golden Bear Pub, just 2 blocks from the zoo. The three had known each other since high school and met regularly to drink and share stories about their week. As the evening wore on and the drinks flowed freely, their conversation grew louder and more boisterous. After several rounds of drinks, the conversation shifted to wild ideas and risky adventures. The zoo came up naturally. It was just a few blocks away, and all three men had grown up visiting it as kids. Fueled by alcohol and a desire to do something reckless, Alexei suggested they sneak in after hours, just to see if they could. Rather than laugh it off, Ivan and Dmitry encouraged the idea, and within minutes the plan was set in motion. At 11:23 p.m., with the temperature at 28 degrees, the three young men stumbled toward the zoo's perimeter. The security lighting cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, and the evening fog provided cover as they searched for a way in. Finding a maintenance ladder near the bear enclosure, Alexei went first, clumsily scaling the 15-foot wall while Ivan and Dmitry kept watch. What the three friends didn't realize was that they were about to encounter one of Europe's most formidable predators. The Eurasian brown bear stands as one of the continent's largest and most dangerous animals. Adult males can weigh up to 1,400 pounds, with the zoo's recent male Boris weighing in at 850 pounds. These bears possess immense strength, capable of flipping 1,500-pound rocks with ease while foraging. Their massive paws are equipped with curved claws up to 5 inches long, perfect for digging and delivering devastating strikes. A brown bear's bite force reaches 975 pounds per square inch, allowing them to crush bones as thick as a human femur effortlessly. Despite their bulk, they can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour over short distances and are excellent swimmers. In Belarus's forests, these bears represent the apex of the food chain, commanding respect through their intelligence, strength, and adaptability. At 11:35 p.m., Alexei dropped down into the enclosure, landing with a soft thud on the frozen ground. The 6,000-square-foot habitat featured artificial rock formations, a deep pool, and several large oak trees. The evening fog had thickened, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. Ivan and Dmitri, still perched on the outer wall of the enclosure, filmed with their phones as Alexei pulled out his own device and switched on its flashlight. Alexei's alcohol-impaired voice carried across the enclosure as he encouraged his friends to join him. His words were slurred and he stumbled slightly as he walked deeper into the habitat. Ivan, never one to back down from a challenge, swung his legs over the wall and followed. Dmitri, more hesitant, remained on the wall but recorded with his phone camera. The enclosure was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the gentle splashing of water from the filtration system. The beam from Alexei's phone light swept across the ground, illuminating scattered bones from Boris's recent meals, a detail that should have served as a warning. At 11:37 p.m., Boris emerged from his den. The 850-pound bear had been awakened by the intruders and moved with surprising stealth for an animal his size. Ivan spotted him first, his alcohol-dulled mind taking precious seconds to process the danger. Boris charged with explosive speed, covering the 30-foot distance between himself and Alexei in less than 2 seconds. The sound of Alexei's scream was cut short as the bear's massive form slammed into him, sending his phone flying into the darkness. The impact alone shattered 3 ribs and his left collarbone. Ivan scrambled back toward the wall in panic, falling and fracturing his ankle in the process. Dmitri, still perched on the wall, fumbled with his phone as he called emergency services, his trembling hands and intoxication making it difficult to dial. The operator initially thought it was a prank call until she heard the horrific sounds in the background. Boris dragged Alexei toward the artificial rock formation, the bear's claws leaving deep gashes across his victim's torso. Each time Alexei attempted to crawl away, the bear would clamp down harder, his powerful jaws crushing bone and tissue. The attack continued for nearly 4 minutes, with Boris treating Alexei exactly as he would natural prey in the wild. Night security guard Mikhail Volkov, alerted by the commotion, arrived at the enclosure at 11:41 p.m. His flashlight beam caught the gruesome scene. Boris was now standing over Alexei's motionless form, the ground around them dark with blood despite the freezing temperature. Volkov immediately radioed for the zoo's emergency response team, but protocol prevented anyone from entering the enclosure while the bear was still active. Ivan had managed to drag himself to the outer fence, where he lay sobbing and repeating Alexei's name. Dmitri remained frozen on the wall, his phone still recording as emergency vehicle lights began to illuminate the area. The first police units arrived, followed by ambulances minutes later, their sirens causing Boris to become even more agitated. The zoo's chief veterinarian, Dr. Elena Petrova, arrived at 11:52 p.m. with tranquilizer equipment, but by then it was clear that any intervention would come too late for Alexei. The bear had to be sedated before emergency personnel could safely enter the enclosure, a process that took an additional 15 minutes. At 12:07 a.m., after confirming Boris was fully sedated, emergency personnel entered the enclosure. The temperature had dropped to 25 degrees, and their flashlights revealed a horrific scene. Alexei's body lay crumpled near the artificial rock formation, surrounded by blood-stained snow. First responders noted that the cold had already begun to freeze the blood around the body. Paramedics pronounced Alexei dead at the scene at 12:13 a.m. The initial assessment revealed catastrophic injuries, a crushed skull, severed spine, and massive trauma to the chest cavity. His winter coat had been torn to shreds, and deep claw marks covered most of his body. The following morning's investigation revealed the full extent of the tragedy. The medical examiner's report documented 94 distinct wounds on Alexei's body. The massive trauma included multiple crushed vertebrae, 17 broken ribs, and severe damage to internal organs. Deep puncture wounds from the bear's 5-inch claws covered his torso, and his right arm had been completely severed during the attack. The massive blood loss had been expedited by the numerous arterial wounds inflicted by Boris's powerful bite. Ivan was treated at Minsk Central Hospital for a compound ankle fracture and severe shock. Dmitri, though physically unharmed, was admitted to the psychiatric ward for acute trauma. The incident sparked immediate changes at Minsk Zoo. Director Sergei Morozov announced a comprehensive security upgrade, including installation of motion sensors and additional cameras. The 15-foot perimeter walls, which had proved insufficient, were topped with electric fencing within a month. Boris was allowed to remain at the zoo after animal behavior experts determined his actions were simply natural defenses against intruders. Following a 2-week observation period, the bear returned to public display. It was January 22, 2017 in Ningbo, China, where the humid air of winter brushed the streets of Yingzhou District. The Ningbo Wildlife Park, a small but well-known zoo nestled on the outskirts of the city, prepared for another day of visitors. As families arrived in droves, the low murmur of chatter filled the air, mixing with the sounds of children laughing and playing near the zoo's playground. The towering walls of the park loomed around its borders, keeping the public at a distance from the animals within. The zoo was home to over 200 species, some native to China, others imported from distant lands. For most visitors, it offered an opportunity to see wildlife up close, though the conditions left much to be desired. The animals, many confined to small, overcrowded enclosures, were often taunted into performing tricks for the audience's entertainment. The filthy conditions and malnourishment of some animals were barely acknowledged by the visitors, and the harsh reality of life in captivity went unnoticed. But to those who spent enough time there, the zoo's grim atmosphere suggested that an accident might be inevitable. Mr. Zhang and his family had planned a simple Sunday afternoon out, accompanied by their friends, the Li family. As they approached the gates, both Mr. Zhang and Mr. Li felt that the 130 yuan entry fee, roughly $18 USD, was far too steep for what the zoo had to offer, so they decided to find another way in. Mr. Zhang's wife, unaware of their scheme, continued toward the main entrance with Mrs. Li and their children, oblivious to the plan that was about to unfold. The walls surrounding the zoo were high, at least 10 feet tall, but a tree near a section of the border caught Mr. Zhang's eye. It was close enough for him and Mr. Li to scale. The men, seeking a cheap thrill and the satisfaction of getting something for nothing, decided to bypass the ticket booth. They grabbed the low-lying branches, hoisted themselves up, and climbed the rest of the way to the top of the perimeter wall. On the other side of the wall, the ground was just a short drop away. Mr. Zhang, eager to see the zoo without paying, crouched down and let himself dangle from the edge. After a moment's hesitation, he let go, landing with a dull thud on the hard ground below. Mr. Li followed suit, both men celebrating their small victory. But a new challenge lay before them. Another wall, this time with sharp metal bars curving toward them like claws, stood in their path. Despite the clear warning signs posted on the wall, Mr. Zhang and Mr. Li pushed forward. Ignoring the signs and the risks involved, they searched for a way over. Mr. Li, with one foot on the other's shoulder, helped Mr. Zhang climb higher, their fingers gripping the bars. The climb wasn't easy, but it was manageable. When they finally reached the top of the second wall, they gazed down. Below them, 3 tigers lay in wait. Unbeknownst to the 2 men, they had climbed into the territory of Ningbo Zoo's most dangerous residents. Mr. Li, his heart pounding in his chest, quickly reconsidered. This was too risky. What had started as a bit of fun had quickly turned into a dangerous predicament. He began to climb down, deciding to retreat. But Mr. Zhang, now committed to the adventure, decided he wouldn't turn back. He was already there, and he wasn't about to leave without exploring the zoo further. Without a second thought, Mr. Zhang dropped down into the tiger enclosure. The tigers, alert to the intruder, stirred from their resting places. Their powerful bodies moved with precision as they slowly approached the new arrival. Mr. Zhang, having underestimated the animal's instinctive response, assumed they would be docile, as he had seen tigers in zoos before, usually disinterested or unbothered by the presence of visitors. But these were not docile creatures. These were wild animals, conditioned by captivity but still very much governed by their instincts. The moment Mr. Zhang's feet hit the ground, the tigers began their calculated approach, eyes fixed on the strange, vulnerable figure below. Visitors who had entered the zoo through the front gates saw what was unfolding in real time. Panicked voices rang out as children screamed and parents frantically tried to pull their families away from the viewing area. Within moments, one of the tigers lunged. It was sudden. The impact was violent. The tiger grabbed Mr. Zhang by the head, sinking its teeth deep into his skull. His scream was swallowed by the animal's powerful jaws. Mr. Zhang tried desperately to fight back, kicking and thrashing, but his body was weak compared to the raw strength of the tiger. His attempts grew more feeble as the tiger's grip tightened. On the wall above, Mr. Li stood frozen, his heart in his throat. He watched helplessly as his friend was mauled before his eyes. The situation was too dangerous for him to intervene. His mind raced, but no solution came. The tiger, with brutal force, tore at Mr. Zhang's body. Its fangs ripped through his jacket, exposing his flesh beneath. The other two tigers circled, keeping a watchful eye on the struggle, their hunger evident. The scene played out in front of horrified onlookers who had no way of stopping the carnage. For over an hour, the tiger toyed with its victim. It dragged Mr. Zhang across the grass, biting into different parts of his body before flipping him onto his back. Visitors watched in shock as Mr. Zhang's life slowly drained away. The tiger never let go. It was a predatory dance, a calculated show of power. The zoo staff had been alerted and armed police soon arrived on the scene. At first, firecrackers were detonated, but the noise had little effect on the tiger. Desperate, zookeepers aimed a powerful hose at the animal, but it barely flinched. The tiger continued to drag Mr. Zhang's body, oblivious to the distractions. The situation escalated quickly. With the tiger still locked on to Mr. Zhang's lifeless body, armed police took action. Under the direction of zoo staff, they fired on the animal, bringing it down. The tiger, once a symbol of raw, untamed power, lay still. The other two tigers were secured and confined to their indoor pens, but the damage had been done. Mr. Zhang, though unconscious, was still alive when emergency responders rushed into the enclosure to retrieve him. He was quickly transported to the hospital, but the wounds were too severe. Hours later, he was pronounced dead. What began as a simple family outing had turned into a devastating tragedy. A wife had lost her husband, children their father, and a tiger had lost its life as a consequence of human recklessness. In the aftermath, the zoo faced heavy scrutiny. Mr. Zhang's family, mourning the loss of their loved one, called for the zoo to take full responsibility. They demanded improvements in security measures, including more surveillance cameras and stricter access controls. They argued that had the zoo's perimeter been more secure, their loved one might still be alive. July 7, 2014 was a windless, heavy morning in South Africa's Limpopo province. The bushveld sat still under the rising sun, acacia branches unmoving, the dry red soil cracked beneath thorn trees. On the outskirts of Hoedspruit, a white Land Cruiser rolled slowly through the gates of a private reserve. Inside, tall fencing enclosed more than a dozen habitats, some filled with birds, others with predators from far beyond the African plains. The man behind it all had just arrived, unaware that today one of those animals wouldn't let him leave. The property, officially registered as a conservation center but operating more like a private menagerie, sprawled across nearly 200 acres of dry scrubland. Its founder, billionaire investor Henry Wallace, had constructed it over several years with imported fencing, custom-built enclosures, and staff quarters for handlers flown in from around the world. The animals housed inside were a mix of legal and gray market acquisitions. tigers from Southeast Asia, hyenas from East Africa, pumas from South America, and even a snow leopard kept in a cooled pen behind the main lodge. While technically permitted under South Africa's exotic animal laws at the time, the facility had faced criticism for poor containment standards and lack of veterinary oversight. Wallace dismissed those concerns. To him, the reserve wasn't a zoo, it was a symbol of control. Adrian Keller, 58, was a German national and former commodities investor who had moved to South Africa in 2006 after taking early retirement. Flush with cash and infatuated with wildlife, he purchased land outside of town and registered it as a private breeding and research facility. Locals knew it as Keller Wildlife Estate, though it was never open to the public. Officially, the compound held rescued and captive-bred animals under permit. Unofficially, it was Adrian's personal collection: lions, curassows, servals, hyenas, and 2 South American pumas that had arrived as cubs in 2012. Of the 2, Lucero, a 6-year-old male puma, was Adrian's favorite. He had been raised in captivity from infancy, bottle-fed and handled daily. Adrian believed they shared a bond. Videos online showed him walking alongside the animal, hand-feeding meat, even allowing the puma to sit beside him while he worked. Critics called it reckless. Adrian called it mutual trust. That morning, Adrian was alone on site. His staff, 3 local employees responsible for feeding and maintenance, were not due until 8 o'clock. According to access logs, Adrian entered Lucero's enclosure just after 7 a.m., carrying a bucket of raw chicken. The outer gate was unlocked, the inner fence left slightly ajar. He walked inside with his back turned. Lucero was lying beneath a shaded shelf at the far edge of the enclosure. His ears twitched, his pupils narrowed. He stood silently and began to stalk forward. Pumas, also known as mountain lions or cougars, are ambush predators. Solitary, muscular, and lightning fast. Though smaller than African lions, a full-grown male can weigh up to 180 pounds and is capable of killing prey many times its size. They rely on silence and explosive motion, aiming for the neck or skull. In captivity, pumas can appear tame for long stretches until instinct takes over. Adrian reached the feeding platform and set down the bucket. Surveillance footage showed him wiping his hands on his pants, turning to speak into his phone. He didn't see Lucero closing in. The puma lunged. The first strike hit Adrian square in the back, claws tearing through his shirt and raking deep into his muscles as he fell hard onto the gravel. Before he could scream, Lucero was already on him. The puma's full weight, nearly 150 pounds, landed squarely across Adrian's torso, pinning him down. Powerful jaws clamped around the base of his neck, crushing his windpipe with a sickening crack. Adrian flailed once, kicking at the dirt, but the fight ended as fast as it began. Lucero shook his head violently, jaw still locked, then released and bit again. This time lower, sinking his teeth into the shoulder and pulling the body backward through the dust. He dragged Adrian toward the corner of the yard, claws gouging the earth, tail lashing in agitation. Blood smeared the gravel behind them in a broken arc. Lucero paused only once, raising his head to scan the fence line, then resumed, panting heavily, his flanks heaving with effort. The entire attack had taken less than half a minute. There were no alarms, no cries for help, just the dull thud of a body being dragged and the slow hush of wind moving through the thorn trees. Just before 8 o'clock, a staff member arrived and saw the enclosure gate unlatched. From a distance, he spotted the puma pacing beside what looked like a pile of fabric. As he approached, the shape resolved. Adrian's body lay half covered in dust, his head bent unnaturally. Blood marked the concrete pad. The employee backed away and called emergency services. Responders confirmed Adrian dead at the scene. The injuries were severe: a crushed larynx, cervical fractures, multiple puncture wounds. Death had likely occurred within moments of the initial bite. Wildlife officials arrived within hours. Lucero was sedated and relocated to a holding facility near Pretoria for behavioral evaluation. His fate sparked debate. Some demanded euthanasia. Others argued that he had only done what wild animals do when startled or presented with an opportunity. In the end, Lucero was transferred to a secured sanctuary in KwaZulu-Natal. No public access, no free handling, no further exposure to risk. Investigations into the facility revealed numerous failings. Safety systems were informal, medical logs were incomplete, several permits were expired. Enclosures lacked adequate double gates and emergency overrides. Adrian Keller's body was flown to Germany at his brother's request. The funeral was held in Munich, attended by family and former colleagues. There was no official statement. The Keller Wildlife Estate was shut down within the month. The remaining animals were rehomed or seized by conservation authorities. The fencing was left to rust. The gates were chained. And in time, the overgrowth returned, swallowing the walking paths and shelter roofs as if reclaiming the land piece by piece. It was September 23, 2023, when Helen Crowley arrived at Wild Wonder Safari Park on the dusty outskirts of Branson, Missouri. The roadside attraction sat between a fireworks outlet and an abandoned gas station, its faded signage promising authentic wildlife encounters for half the price of legitimate zoos. Rusted chain-link fencing surrounded weathered enclosures where concrete had cracked and weeds pushed through gaps in the pavement. The facility operated with minimal staff and maximum profit margins, cutting corners wherever possible to maintain its budget-friendly reputation. Helen, a 63-year-old retired tax accountant from Fort Worth, had driven 3 hours specifically for this place after reading online reviews praising its hands-on approach to animal interactions. She clutched her discount coupon tightly, having chosen this facility over the more expensive Branson attractions because she believed most safety regulations were simply bureaucratic nonsense designed to fleece honest customers. Her late husband Robert had often warned her that her stubborn streak would get her into serious trouble someday, but Helen had dismissed his concerns just as readily as she now dismissed the safety rules. The irony wasn't lost on her friends back home, who knew that Helen meticulously followed every tax regulation to the letter in her professional life, while completely ignoring common sense safety rules everywhere else. Her decades of penny-pinching habits and stubborn conviction that rules were meant for people who didn't know better had shaped her approach to most situations throughout her retirement years. The African lion paced restlessly in his cramped enclosure, a magnificent but aging male whose golden mane had dulled from years of captivity in substandard conditions. These apex predators, weighing up to 420 pounds, possess a crushing jaw strength of 650 pounds per square inch and can accelerate to 50 miles per hour in short bursts. Their territorial instincts remain razor-sharp even in captivity, triggered by sudden movements or perceived threats to their domain. Lions in confined spaces often develop heightened aggression due to stress and lack of adequate stimulation, making them particularly dangerous to untrained individuals. Helen approached the lion exhibit, expecting the premium experience advertised online, but found only standard viewing through reinforced bars with peeling paint and rust stains. Growing increasingly agitated, she cornered the lone attendant, a college student more focused on his phone than visitor safety protocols. She demanded access to the real lion experience she had paid for, insisting that proper animal handling was simply about projecting confidence and that she'd successfully managed large dogs throughout her life. When the attendant stepped away to refill the water pan, he carelessly left the service gate unlatched while distracted by the text message from his girlfriend. Helen noticed the gap immediately and slipped through the unlocked gate into the lion's territory without hesitation. She moved slowly toward the massive predator, convinced her calm demeanor would demonstrate dominance over what she dismissed as an oversized house cat that simply had been pampered by inexperienced handlers. The lion's ears flattened against his skull as this unfamiliar human invaded his space, his amber eyes tracking her every movement with predatory focus. Helen continued her approach, whispering reassurances about her experience with large dogs, completely misreading the animal's warning signals as mere curiosity rather than mounting aggression. The lion's muscles tensed as his territorial instincts engaged, a low rumble building in his chest that Helen mistook for purring. His tail began twitching rapidly, another clear danger sign that went unrecognized. Without warning, he exploded forward with devastating speed, covering the 15-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. His massive paw struck Helen's chest with bone-crushing force, sending her sprawling backward onto the concrete with multiple rib fractures. His jaws clamped down on her throat with hydraulic pressure, severing her carotid artery instantly while his claws raked across her torso, puncturing vital organs and causing massive internal bleeding. The attack lasted mere moments before staff members arrived with tranquilizer equipment, but Helen had already succumbed to massive blood loss and catastrophic trauma to her neck and chest cavity. The Missouri Department of Agriculture launched an immediate investigation into Wild Wonder Safari Park, citing multiple safety violations and inadequate staffing protocols that had created the conditions for this preventable tragedy. The facility faced permanent closure, while Helen's family pursued legal action against the owners for gross negligence and wrongful death. Animal rights groups called for stricter oversight of private wildlife facilities and mandatory safety training for all staff members. On the morning of January 5th, 2002, the air in Novosibirsk, Russia was freezing cold. The sky was a solid gray and snow covered the streets. The wind blew sharply through the trees near the zoo and everything felt still and quiet. At the Novosibirsk Zoo, frost covered the railings and workers' breath turned into white mist in the cold air. Everything seemed normal, but something wasn't right. Something small had gone wrong, and no one had noticed. Igor Stepanov was 46 years old. He arrived at the zoo like he did every morning, dressed in heavy winter gear, a cigarette already burning between his fingers. He wasn't in a hurry. Igor had worked at the zoo for almost 20 years, and he liked the routine. He wasn't scared of the animals, he respected them. In his younger days, he had served in the military in Afghanistan. Since then, everyday dangers didn't worry him much. He trusted strong fences and good locks. He believed wild animals could be kept safely behind barriers if people followed the rules. Igor lived alone in a small apartment. His wife had passed away years ago, and he didn't talk to his grown son in Moscow very often. But he was okay with that. He liked quiet. He read old science fiction books, fixed radios, and drank vodka only on special days. His life was simple, and the zoo gave him something important to do. He wasn't an animal expert, he was an electrician, but he saw the animals every day. He liked the wolves and the snow leopards, but one cat stood out to him. Barak, a Persian leopard, lived near the back of the zoo. He didn't show himself often, but when he did, his yellow-green eyes were unforgettable. They always seemed to be watching. In the weeks before the attack, the zoo had been doing repairs, fixing fences, rerouting power, and working on heating systems for the animals. Igor had been working on the electrical parts near the big cat's enclosure. One day during the repairs, something had gone wrong. A part of the steel fence on Barak's cage hadn't been locked properly. From far away it looked fine, but up close one hinge didn't line up, leaving a small gap big enough for a leopard to get through. Barak didn't run out right away. He waited as big cats do, moving only when no one was around. When the workers went home and the night was quiet, Barak squeezed through the gap. He blended into the snowy trees behind the zoo. No alarms went off, no cameras saw him. No one knew he was loose. That morning, Igor looked over his work list. There was a small problem near the heating system behind the leopard enclosure, probably something frozen or a sensor not working. He called in over the radio but didn't get a reply. That wasn't unusual in that area, so he walked there alone, carrying his toolbox. His breath made small clouds in the freezing air. The maintenance shed was quiet and covered in snow. It stood near the edge of the zoo behind the animal pens. As Igor stepped inside to check the heating system, Barack was already nearby. The leopard was hidden in a clump of snowy bushes near the back fence. His spotted winter coat blended perfectly with the snow and shadows, making him almost invisible. The thick trees and drifting snow made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The attack happened fast. There was no warning sound. Leopards don't roar before they strike. They're solitary and almost ghost-like in winter. Native to the rugged mountains of Iran and Central Asia, these leopards are smaller than lions but no less deadly. Their thick spotted coats allow them to vanish into rocky or snowy terrain. Built for stealth, Persian leopards rely on silence and ambush. They don't roar, they don't charge. They wait hidden, and when they strike, it's fast and final. In the icy quiet of Novosibirsk, Barack was perfectly at home. Barack leapt through the snow like a shadow. Igor didn't see him coming. The big cat hit him hard, slamming him against the metal shed. Igor tried to run to fight back, but Barack's teeth sank into his neck. Igor struggled. He was strong, but it didn't matter. His body collapsed into the snow as the red spread out beneath him. There were no cameras near the shed. No one saw what had happened. The other zoo workers were busy feeding the elk or checking the penguins. Igor's body lay behind the shed, slowly being covered by falling snow. Barack disappeared again, walking silently into the woods. 2 hours passed before anyone realized Igor was missing. When he didn't check in, a search started. A young worker found blood near the back trail and called for help. Panic spread across the zoo. Keepers locked down the area and called the city for backup. It took 4 hours to find Barack. A drone with a heat sensor spotted him resting under a pine tree not far from the shed. A zookeeper shot him with a tranquilizer dart. Barack didn't run, he just closed his eyes and fell asleep. The zoo closed for 2 weeks. Investigators came right away. They checked every fence and every gate. They found the weak spot in the leopard cage. It had been missed during a repair job. The person in charge of that shift was fired. Zoos across Russia changed their safety rules after that. From then on, all big cat enclosures had to be triple checked. Some even added heat cameras to keep track of the animals at night. The path behind the shed was closed forever. Snow covered the blood and tools. But the zoo workers didn't forget. They said Igor's name quietly, not in public speeches, but to remind each other. Double check the gates. Always be sure. Wild animals may live behind fences, but they're still wild. It was April 20th, 2007 in Beihai City, located in South China's Guangxi Autonomous Region. The famous holiday resort Yintan, also known as Silver Beach, was a place of allure, drawing visitors from all corners of the country. This resort, with its gleaming sands and serene waters, was typically a retreat for families seeking leisure. The beach, known as the finest in China, stretched for miles under the golden sun, its quartz sand shimmering like silver beneath the sunlight. Tourists engaged in water sports, swimming and picnicking along the coast, all the while oblivious to the more perilous side of the resort. At the edge of the beach stood the holiday resort, which housed a variety of entertainment, including a notorious crocodile show. The crocodiles were kept in a small, inconspicuous enclosure where they performed for visitors. The spectacle included throwing dead meat into the water or holding it high for the crocodiles to leap, sometimes as high as 5 feet into the air. Visitors marveled at the reptiles' power and agility. But the enclosure wasn't just a place for entertainment. To the children of the nearby primary schools, the crocodile enclosure had become a place of daredevil challenges. Every few days, groups of boys would sneak into the area after school hours, climbing over the low wall surrounding the pool and daring each other to get as close as possible to the crocodiles. Armed with sticks and rocks, they would rush into the enclosure and smack the crocodiles on their heads before fleeing back to safety. It was a cruel game, one that seemed harmless to the children, but one which held terrible consequences for those who were brave enough to participate. That evening at around 6 p.m., a group of 4 9-year-old boys from CNN Primary School, Lu Heyang among them, decided to take part in the infamous Crocodile Challenge. With wooden sticks, slingshots, and a handful of pebbles, the group walked to the resort. The resort was closed for the day and the grounds were eerily quiet. The gates weren't locked, offering an easy entry for the children, who moved swiftly, staying as quiet as possible. The wall surrounding the crocodile pool stood at only a meter in height in some places, and in others it was as low as 55 centimeters or 22 inches tall. It was not designed to keep people out, and it was certainly no match for a determined group of children. There had even been an incident a few years prior when several of the crocodiles managed to escape through a drainage pipe that led to the beach. A panic ensued when sunbathers and swimmers were suddenly confronted by the reptiles, but fortunately no one was harmed before the crocodiles were recaptured. As Liu and his friends climbed the low wall and dropped into the enclosure, they ignored the large warning signs that were clearly displayed, urging visitors to stay away from the crocodiles. But the thrill of the challenge outweighed any caution for the boys. They dropped into the pool area, and the crocodiles, many of them basking on the sides of the pool, looked up curiously at the newcomers. The children quickly began loading their slingshots with rocks, shooting them at the reptiles. The rocks struck with a thud, and some of the crocodiles hissed and slid into the water to escape. The true test of bravery came next. One of the boys, in an act of defiance, ran up to a crocodile and, with a stick in hand, slammed it down on the creature's head before sprinting away with excitement. The other boys watched eagerly, waiting for their turn. When it was Liu's turn, he took up the stick and walked toward the same crocodile. The animal, having already been provoked, was on edge. As Liu swung the stick down on its head, the crocodile in an instant lunged forward. Its jaw snapped with terrifying precision, and in a flash, Liu was dragged into the water by his shirt. His terrified screams echoed through the empty resort, but they were drowned out by the roar of the water. The other boys rushed to the pool's edge, one of them reaching out to grab Liu's hand, but it was too late. Liu was pulled under the water as the crocodile readjusted its grip and tightened its deadly jaws on his torso. The boys could see Liu's eyes bulging in fear as he momentarily surfaced. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was evident in his eyes, but there was nothing they could do. The other 10 crocodiles, sensing the commotion and the smell of fresh blood, slid into the water and began to feast on the helpless boy. Liu's friends could only watch in helpless horror as their friend was torn apart by the beasts. A dark cloud of blood swirled in the murky water. The once quiet pool now a scene of carnage. The children, their hearts racing with fear, scrambled to escape. They leapt over the wall, racing for help. Their desperate cries were heard by Liu Zhan, the crocodile keeper. Hired by the park after the previous escape incident, Liu Zhan had the responsibility of managing the crocodiles. However, that evening the pool had been closed for the day, and the keeper was inside cooking a meal. He hadn't noticed the children sneaking into the enclosure. Upon hearing the children's screams, Liu Zhan rushed to the crocodile pool. What he saw was beyond anything he could have imagined. The water was turbulent and the crocodiles were still in the midst of their feeding frenzy. Liu's body was partially submerged in the water, his lifeless form being tugged in different directions by the monstrous reptiles. The sight was harrowing. When the police arrived, they quickly called in special armed units. A group of snipers was dispatched to deal with the crocodiles. Armed with raw pork, the snipers lured the crocodiles out of the water, where they were distracted by the food. As the crocodiles emerged, the snipers took aim at the one believed to have killed Liu. 7 bullets struck the enormous creature, a 2.6 meter, 8.5 foot long, 330-pound predator. The crocodile was dragged out of the pool and transported to a trailer for dissection. Inside its stomach, they found the remains of Liu's body. Though the other crocodiles had participated in the attack, it was this particular reptile that had caused most of the damage. Following the attack, the pool was drained and the remaining crocodiles were removed. The animals were relocated to the Zhangji Endangered Wild Animal Protection Center in Nanning, a facility that had the proper permits and infrastructure to house such dangerous creatures. The 3 children who had witnessed the brutal attack were left in a state of shock. They were unable to fully comprehend what had occurred, their minds struggling to process the horror. They were incoherent when questioned by the police, their eyes filled with terror. At night, they woke screaming from nightmares, their minds trapped in the trauma of the event. A doctor from Bai People's Hospital, Liu Wei, confirmed that the children were receiving psychological treatment, and he urged the school staff to avoid discussing the incident in front of them while they tried to cope with the aftermath. In the courts, the responsibility for Liu's death fell on the park and the crocodile keeper. It was determined that the crocodile enclosure had not been properly secured and that the park had operated without the necessary licenses to keep the animals. The courts awarded Liu's family compensation 220,000 yuan, the equivalent of about $3,600, but no amount of money could bring back their son. What began as a dare, an innocent challenge that had been carried out countless times before by local children, had ended in tragedy. The game, once a source of excitement and thrill, had turned into a nightmare for all involved. And for Liu Haiyang, the crocodile challenge had been his ultimate test. Thanks for watching. Don't stop here. Click the video on your screen now for more.